The lake had always been more than water to me. It was memory, inheritance, and sanctuary all woven into one glittering surface that reflected the sky like a silver mirror. When I first bought the property nearly 2 decades ago, people told me I was crazy for taking on so much land with a body of water that would just cause problems. They thought the upkeep would ruin me, that I would drown in maintenance costs and government restrictions, that a man alone couldn't manage what had once been owned by a corporation. But I had fallen in love the moment I stood on that grassy bank and felt the cool breath of the lake sweep across my face. The water stretched out like freedom itself, untouched, bordered by tall pines that whispered in the wind, and for a moment I felt as though the world had carved out a piece of paradise and set it aside just for me. That lake was mine, written into the deed, traced in legal language that left no doubt. The land, the water, the access, every inch of shoreline belonged to me. Owning it wasn't a burden. It was a privilege, one I guarded fiercely. For years, the lake was quiet. My mornings began with coffee on the porch, watching mist rise in pale ribbons from the water's surface, listening to the distant calls of loons, the splash of fish breaking through the calm. Sometimes, on hot afternoons, I'd strip down to shorts and dive in, letting the cool water close over me like a baptism, washing away all the noise of the world. Neighbors would wave from their docks, sometimes paddle over to share a beer, but there was never conflict, never tension. Everyone respected the lake and, more importantly, respected that it was mine. Even when developers began circling, eyeing the land around the water, I managed to negotiate boundaries, easements, agreements that allowed them to build their neighborhoods and create their HOAs without ever touching the ownership of the lake itself. They could sell lake view properties, but not lake rights. That line was clear, and I believed it would remain that way forever. But time has a way of drawing in people who test boundaries, and if I had known what sort of neighbor fate was about to send me, I might have fought harder to keep the quiet. Her name was Karen. I remember the first time I saw her, striding down the gravel road that wound between the new homes on the ridge and the path to the lake. She had the kind of posture that suggested ownership of every square foot she walked. On, chin lifted, eyes sharp behind oversized sunglasses, her voice carrying long before she reached you. She introduced herself not as Karen, but as the new president of the Lakeside Homeowners Association. And before I could even offer my name, she was already listing rules, bylaws, expectations. It was clear she wasn't the kind of person who came to a neighborhood to live peacefully. She came to rule it. At first, I ignored her. I didn't live under HOA jurisdiction, and she knew it. My property, my lake, my rules. Still, she lingered, always circling the edges of my land, like a hawk that hadn't yet decided whether to swoop. If she saw me fishing, she'd call out reminders about quiet hours. If she noticed me loading a canoe, she'd mention lake safety. Small intrusions, subtle at first, but every comment carried that same undercurrent. She believed she had authority where she did not. The neighbors seemed to bend to her will, nodding nervously, following her directives as though she carried a badge. I, on the other hand, was not so easily intimidated. It was late spring when the tension began to thicken, the kind of golden afternoon when the lake looked irresistible. I had just finished patching a section of dock, and, sweaty and sore, I walked, straight off the boards and plunged into the water. The shock of cold was glorious, a kind of electric relief that made me laugh out loud as I surfaced, slicking my hair back, the sunlight warm on my face. I floated there for a while, staring up at the sky, letting the peace of it settle into my bones. That was when I noticed her, standing on the shore with a clipboard in hand. Karen. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't even blinking. She was writing when I climbed out and walked toward the bank, dripping. She clicked her pen with the kind of satisfaction that made my stomach turn. "You know," she said, There are very specific HOA regulations about swimming times, approved areas, and safety guidelines. What you just did, she gestured to the lake as though it were hers, is not permitted without proper authorization. I stared at her, dumbfounded, then laughed. Karen, I said, this is my lake. It's written in the deed. The HOA doesn't have jurisdiction here. She pursed her lips, the kind of expression people wear when they've already decided they're right and you're just background noise. We'll see about that, she said, and with that, she walked away, heels crunching in the gravel, clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon. I didn't think much of it then. She was just being Karen, overreaching, trying to flex her authority. But a week later, I opened my mailbox and found an envelope stamped with the HOA's seal. Inside was a notice of violation. Unauthorized swimming activity. Fine, $1,000. My blood ran hot. At first I thought it was a joke, some sort of administrative mistake. But as I read the fine print, the language sharpened. They cited sections of their bylaws, claimed jurisdiction over the shared natural resource, and warned that failure to pay within 30 days would result in further enforcement actions. I held the paper in my hands, stunned, the absurdity of it rattling in my skull. A fine, for swimming, in my own lake, and that was the moment something in me shifted. Until then, I had lived with a kind of quiet tolerance for the HOA's presence, brushing off their overreach as neighborhood politics that didn't touch me. But this was different. This was a declaration of war, and if Karen wanted to test whether her clipboard and bylaws held more weight than the legal deed I kept locked in my safe, she was about to learn a very expensive lesson. The fine sat on my kitchen table for 3 days, like an insult I couldn't bring myself to throw away, a sheet of paper that seemed to radiate arrogance every time I walked past it. I kept reading the words, hoping they would rearrange themselves into something logical, something less insane than what they declared, that I, the legal owner of the lake, had somehow violated rules that didn't apply to me, and that I now owed $1,000 for daring to swim in water that had been mine long before Karen had ever dreamed of moving into the neighborhood. I showed it to a few friends, and each one reacted the same way, first laughter, then confusion, then outrage. But as the days passed, the humor drained out of the situation and left behind only irritation, then anger, then a cold determination. The fine wasn't about money. It was about power. Karen was testing me, poking at the edges of my patience to see if I would fold, to see if I would pay quietly, and in doing so acknowledge her supposed authority. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear that this was not an accident of paperwork or an overzealous administrator. This was Karen's doing, deliberate and calculated. I remembered the way she had watched me from the shore that afternoon, writing on her clipboard with the smug precision of someone who already knew how she would use it against me. She wanted a confrontation, and she wanted to prove to everyone in the HOA that even I, the man who owned the lake, wasn't beyond her reach. If she could find me, she could find anyone. It was a power play, plain and simple, and I wasn't about to let it slide. On the 4th day, I drove down to the HOA office, a squat brick building on the edge of the subdivision that looked more like a bank than a neighborhood resource. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and printer ink. A receptionist greeted me with the kind of forced politeness that suggested she spent most of her day deflecting complaints. When I asked to speak to the president, her eyes flickered with something like sympathy before she gestured toward a door at the end of the hall. "She's expecting you," she said, which only deepened my sense of unease. Karen was waiting behind a large desk, papers neatly stacked, a little American flag planted in a holder beside her computer monitor. She didn't offer me a seat at first. Instead, she leaned back, steepling her fingers, and regarded me as though I were a student called into the principal's office. "Ah," she said at last, "Mr. Lake Owner, I thought we might have this conversation sooner rather than later." I dropped the violation notice on her desk. "This is nonsense," I said flatly. "The lake is mine. I own it outright. You don't get to fine me for using my own property." Her smile was small, controlled, like a knife kept hidden until the right moment. "Ownership," she said, tapping her pen against the paper, "does not exempt you from community standards. The lake is a shared resource, and we have bylaws that govern its safe and appropriate use. You may hold the deed, but that doesn't mean you're above the rules that protect everyone." I leaned forward, my voice low but sharp. "Read your bylaws again. The HOA does not own the lake. The HOA has no jurisdiction over the lake, and the idea that you can charge me $1,000 for taking a swim is absurd." Her expression never wavered, though I could see a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. "You're welcome to contest the fine at the next HOA board meeting," she said sweetly. "But I should warn you, the board is very supportive of consistent enforcement. If we let you ignore the rules, what example would that set for the rest of the community?" That was when it hit me. She had stacked the board. The so-called support wasn't organic, it was engineered. She had maneuvered herself into power, pulled strings, manipulated votes, and filled the board with people too timid or too complicit to challenge her. It wasn't just Karen, it was Karen, plus her hand-picked chorus. I left the office that day, seething, the violation notice crumpled in my fist. For the first time in years, the lake didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a battlefield, and every ripple on its surface seemed to whisper that a storm was coming. The days leading up to the board meeting were filled with quiet strategy. I spent hours digging through old files, pulling out deeds, easements, and legal documents that traced the history of the lake back nearly a century. I wanted to make sure there was no ambiguity, no loophole she could exploit. The language was clear. Full ownership of the lake and surrounding shoreline was mine, transferred without conditions, independent of the subdivision and its HOA. If there had ever been an argument to the contrary, it had dissolved long before Karen arrived. The more I read, the more confident I became that I was on solid ground. But Karen wasn't fighting with law. She was fighting with perception, with control, with the fear she instilled in the people around her. That was harder to combat. When the night of the meeting arrived, the community hall was already buzzing with voices. Rows of folding chairs filled the room, and neighbors sat clustered in little knots, whispering to one another. Some glanced at me when I walked in, offering quick nods of support, but most looked away, unwilling to be caught on the wrong side of Karen's wrath. At the front of the room, the board sat behind a long table, Karen in the center like a queen at court, gavel in hand. She opened the meeting with her usual performance, updates on landscaping, reminders about trash collection, warnings about speeding in the neighborhood. Then she cleared her throat and moved to violation notices. My name was the first one she called. Mr. She paused deliberately, as though struggling to remember my last name. Has been cited for unauthorized swimming activity in the community lake. The fine is $1,000, payable within 30 days. Failure to comply may result in additional penalties. Before I could speak, she launched into a speech about fairness, about how no one should be above the rules, about the importance of maintaining order. Her voice filled the room, confident and commanding, and I could see neighbors nodding along, more out of habit than conviction. Finally, she looked at me and gestured for a response. I stood slowly, unfolding the deed I had brought with me. My voice carried, steady and deliberate, as I read aloud, "Parcel number 1347, including full rights to the body of water known as Silver Pine Lake, with no restrictions, no covenants, and no association oversight. The lake is private property. My property, which means your fine is not only baseless, it's unlawful." A murmur rippled through the room. Karen's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Ownership," she repeated smoothly, does not place you above community standards. This isn't about standards, I shot back. This is about power. You are trying to extend your authority where you have none. And if you continue, I will have no choice but to involve the county and my attorney. The room grew tense, neighbors shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Karen banged her gavel to cut off the whispers. "We'll table this matter until further review," she said briskly, her voice tight. "The fine stands until then." It was a tactical retreat, but I could see the anger in her eyes. She hadn't expected me to push back so publicly, and she certainly hadn't expected me to come armed with documentation. But she also wasn't backing down. Not yet. When I walked out of that hall, the night air cool against my skin, I knew the battle was only beginning. Karen had made her move. With the $1,000 fine, now it was my turn. The weeks after that board meeting felt like the tightening of a bowstring, every moment drawn taut with tension as Karen and I circled each other in a silent duel. She continued to strut through the neighborhood like a monarch, clipboard always, in hand, issuing violation notices for everything from improperly coiled hoses to holiday decorations exceeding permitted size. I heard from neighbors that she had fined one family for leaving their garbage cans out too long, another for painting their shutters a shade darker than approved brown. The HOA under her rule was less a community and more a kingdom, and she wielded her power with merciless precision. But what struck me most was how people submitted. They paid the fines, grumbled quietly behind closed doors, but rarely stood up to her face. Fear had become her currency, and compliance her throne. I, however, was not built for submission. The $1,000 fine remained unpaid, a red flag she waved in every newsletter and meeting agenda. Outstanding violation, pending enforcement. The documents would say, my name highlighted as though I were a criminal. But every time I saw it, my resolve hardened. I wasn't going to be bullied into submission. If Karen wanted a war, she would have one. The key to winning, I knew, wasn't in shouting louder than her or throwing accusations in the community hall. It was in precision, in patience, in finding the crack in her foundation and widening it until the whole structure collapsed around her. So I began to study, not just my deed, which I already knew backward and forward, but the very machinery of the HOA itself. I requested public records, combed through budgets and expense reports, scrutinized bylaws and meeting minutes. At first glance, it all seemed ordinary. Landscaping fees, community pool maintenance, road repairs, legal reserves. But as I dug deeper, patterns began to emerge. The HOA, like so many others, relied heavily on shared resource clauses to justify its fees. And though they didn't own the lake, they had quietly built their finances around the illusion that they did. Annual dues included line items for lake preservation and aquatic safety patrols, costs that were baked into every homeowner's bill, approved long before Karen had arrived, when previous boards simply assumed no one would challenge them. It was a subtle sleight of hand, charging residents for something they had no legal right to control. Most homeowners never questioned it. But now, with Karen pushing her authority into absurd extremes, the loophole became my weapon. If the HOA was collecting money for the lake, then by their own documents they had tethered themselves to my property. They couldn't claim jurisdiction without also claiming financial responsibility, and if they were financially responsible, then so were the residents, which meant, in theory, I could make them pay. The realization hit me late one night, the glow of my desk lamp spilling across the scattered papers and highlighted passages. I leaned back in my chair, the edges of a smile tugging at my lips. Karen had been so intent on proving she could fine me for using my lake, but in doing so, she had overlooked the deeper truth. The HOA's entire financial structure depended on the existence of my lake. Without it, half their budgetary justification evaporated. And if I pushed the issue, if I formally demanded reimbursement for maintenance, insurance, and liability coverage, the HOA, and by extension Karen, would be forced to pay. The next step was gathering evidence. I began cataloging every receipt and invoice I had paid over the years for the lake's upkeep: dock repairs, erosion control, dredging, liability insurance premiums. The numbers weren't small. In fact, when totaled across a decade, the expenses dwarfed anything the HOA had ever spent on their so-called preservation. And the more I stacked the papers, the more my case grew ironclad. I wasn't just the lake's owner in name. I was the one who had funded its very survival. Of course, strategy required more than legal ammunition. It required timing and presentation. I started talking quietly with neighbors, those who had grown tired of Karen's reign, but were too afraid to oppose her openly. Over backyard fences, over beers by the fire pit, they confided their frustrations. They resented the constant fines, the arbitrary rules, the way Karen treated them like subjects instead of equals. When I mentioned that the HOA had been charging them for lake upkeep that wasn't theirs to charge, their eyes widened. "Wait," one man said, gripping his bottle tighter. "You mean we've been paying for something we don't even own?" I nodded. "And if Karen keeps pushing me, she's going to pay a whole lot more." Word spread slowly, like sparks on dry grass. Whispers of dissent began to circulate, neighbors comparing notes, realizing just how much money they had funneled into Karen's kingdom without question. The fear that had once silenced them began to erode, replaced with irritation, even anger. And though they weren't ready to revolt outright, their unease was a seed I intended to water. Karen, oblivious to the quiet shift, continued her campaign. Another violation notice arrived in my mailbox, this time for failure to comply with swim safety protocol. I laughed out loud as I read it, then tucked it into my growing folder of evidence. Every absurd action she took only strengthened my case. She thought she was tightening the noose, but in reality she was weaving the rope that would eventually hang her authority. By the time the next board meeting rolled around, I was ready. I walked into the hall with a binder thick enough to snap a table leg, every page meticulously tabbed and highlighted. Karen eyed it with suspicion as I took my seat, but she said nothing. She began the meeting as always, wielding her gavel like a scepter, rattling off agenda items with the crisp efficiency of someone who loved the sound of her own voice. When she reached outstanding violations, she paused, savoring the moment. "Mr. Lake Owner continues to refuse payment of his fine," she announced, voice dripping with theatrical disappointment. "At this point, the board may consider escalation." That was my cue. I stood slowly, opened my binder, and let the weight of it thud against the table. Heads turned. Karen's smile faltered. "Before you escalate," I said, my voice calm but carrying across the room, "you might want to review this." I flipped the binder open and began to read, not just the deed, but the financial records that tied the HOA to my property. Listed the expenses I had shouldered alone: dredging, dock repairs, liability insurance. Then I turned the knife. "By charging your members for lake upkeep, you have already admitted financial responsibility for my property, which means, under civil code, you owe me reimbursement. By my calculations, you've underpaid by tens of thousands over the last decade. If you want to play the fine game, I can play too." The room went silent. I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights, the rustle of papers as neighbors craned their necks to see the binder. Karen's face drained of color, her lips pressed into a thin line as though she were biting back words. She banged the gavel once, twice, desperate to reassert control. "This is out of order," she snapped, completely irrelevant to the issue at hand. But the damage was done. The neighbors were whispering now, no longer afraid, their eyes wide with realization. One man stood. "Is that true?" he asked. "We've been paying for something that isn't even ours?" Others nodded, voices rising in a low rumble of dissent. Karen's control was slipping, her authority unraveling thread by thread, and she knew it. I closed the binder with deliberate calm. "You wanted to fine me. $1,000, I said evenly. "But if you insist on pursuing this, I'll have no choice but to invoice the HOA for every expense I've ever paid to maintain this lake. And believe me, the number will make your little fine look like pocket change." The board meeting dissolved. Into chaos after that, neighbors demanding answers, Karen shouting to restore order, the gavel pounding uselessly against the table. I walked out into the night air, the binder tucked under my arm, a slow smile spreading across my face. The counterattack had begun, and for the first time since this madness started, I felt the tide turning. Karen had thought she could fine me into submission. Instead, I had found the weapon that would raise her own fees by $5,000, and possibly much more. The weeks after that explosive board meeting felt like the quiet before a thunderstorm, a strange stillness that hummed with the promise of chaos. Karen had lost her grip on the room that night, and though she'd tried to pound the gavel and bark her authority back into place, something fundamental had shifted in the air. Neighbors who had once bowed their heads and nodded along with every decree now looked at her differently. Doubt had slipped in, and doubt was poison to a tyrant. But Karen wasn't the type to slink away after one defeat. No, if anything, the silence that followed was more dangerous. I could feel her scheming behind the scenes, rallying what loyalists she still had, plotting her next move. She had built her power on fear and control, and I had taken a hammer to, both in one night. Now she would come at me harder than ever. Sure enough, the first salvo landed a week later. A thick envelope appeared in my mailbox, this time not just a violation notice, but a full legal demand. The language was aggressive, threatening liens, property assessments, even potential litigation. It was absurd on its face. The HOA had no authority over my property, no legal jurisdiction over the lake, and certainly no power to place a lien on land that was entirely outside their charter. But the message was clear. Karen was doubling down. She was going to try to bury me in paperwork, drag me through a maze of bureaucracy until I either gave in or collapsed under the weight of her persistence. It was the tactic of a bully who had lost the crowd but was determined to win through attrition. I didn't take the bait. Instead, I doubled down myself. I called my attorney, a sharp-witted man named Harris, who had the patience of a chess player and the smile of someone who relished a good fight. I spread the HOA documents across his conference table, outlining the pattern I'd uncovered. The bogus lake maintenance fees, the illegitimate claims of jurisdiction, the financial dependence they had unwittingly tethered to my property. He leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against his chin, and finally grinned. "This is brilliant," he said. "They've built their budget on something they don't own. If they push, we push back, hard. And if we do this right, Karen won't just lose her fine. She'll end up paying more than she ever imagined." Together, we crafted the plan. Step 1. Formally invoice the HOA for 10 years of unpaid lake maintenance, complete with receipts, contracts, and legal justification. Step 2. Present the invoice publicly at the next board meeting, leaving no room for Karen to dismiss it as irrelevant. Step 3. If the HOA balked, file a civil claim, dragging their finances into court where every homeowner would see exactly how much money Karen had gambled on her overreach. It wasn't just about winning. It was about making the cost of her arrogance undeniable. When the night of the meeting arrived, the community hall was packed. Word had spread fast, neighbors buzzing with rumors of what I had uncovered, eager to see if Karen would finally be knocked from her throne. She sat at the head of the table, posture stiff, lips pressed into a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. I could tell she was rattled, though she tried to mask it with the usual theatrics. She banged the gavel, called the meeting to order, and launched into her agenda with mechanical precision. But when it came time for financial matters, I stood, binder in hand, and the room fell into expectant silence. "This," I said, laying the invoice on the table, "is the true cost of the lake." I listed every expense I had paid over the years: repairs, dredging, liability insurance, erosion control, line by line, the numbers climbing higher and higher until gasps echoed around the room. Total, $84,623. By charging residents for lake maintenance, this HOA has acknowledged its financial responsibility for my property. Therefore, I am now demanding reimbursement. Starting tonight, I will be applying a proportional fee to every household, calculated according to the HOA's own structure of dues. That includes you, Karen. The reaction was electric. Neighbors whispered, some laughed nervously, others sat in stunned silence. One man blurted out, "You mean we've been paying all this time for nothing?" Another woman turned on Karen, her voice sharp. "Did you know about this? Did you let us all throw money at something you don't even own?" Karen banged her gavel furiously, shouting for order, but the more she yelled, the less anyone listened. Finally, she snapped, "This is ridiculous! He can't do this! He doesn't have the authority!" I cut her off, my voice calm but firm. "You gave me the authority when you charged for what wasn't yours. You claimed the lake as a shared resource. Now you can share the cost. Starting with an additional $5,000 on your personal dues, Karen. Consider it reimbursement for the years you've tried to fine me." The room erupted. Some laughed outright, others clapped, and a few homeowners even cheered. Karen's face went crimson, her composure cracking for the first time since I'd known her. She sputtered, pointing her finger at me, at the board, at anyone who would meet her gaze, but no words came out that carried any weight. The spell was broken. The fear she had ruled with had evaporated in the face of raw truth and cold numbers. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift. Neighbors rallied behind me, not just because they liked me, but because they were furious at her deception. Petitions circulated. Demands for her resignation grew louder. The board, sensing the shift in power, began distancing themselves from her, scrambling to save their own reputations. And Karen, once the iron-fisted queen of the HOA, found herself isolated, her clipboard suddenly meaningless, her authority dismantled piece by piece. As for the lake, it returned to being what it had always been for me, a sanctuary. I swam when I pleased, fished when I pleased, and watched the sunset without the shadow of her disapproving stare. The $1,000 fine that had sparked this war was nothing but a memory, a joke I sometimes recounted to friends over a drink. But the $5,000 increase, in her dues, that was real, tangible, and poetic. It was justice measured not in court rulings or shouted arguments, but in the language Karen understood best: money. And every time I saw her trudging past the lake, avoiding my eyes, her shoulders hunched under the weight of a neighborhood that no longer bowed to her, I couldn't help but smile. She had tried to claim power over me with a fine, but in the end, it was her own wallet that paid the price. 5 times over. The lake remained mine, and so did the victory.